It is the summer of 1940. Across the Channel, Nazi Germany is preparing for the greatest invasion in human history. The Wehrmacht has conquered France in less than 6 weeks. The British Expeditionary Force has been evacuated from the beaches of Dunkirk in a desperate retreat that left behind most of its heavy equipment. The German army stands poised on the French coast, looking across the narrow waters of the English Channel at the island nation that has declared itself unwilling to surrender. The people of Britain know what is coming. They can feel it in the air, in the anxious whispers in neighborhoods, in the preparation of air raid shelters carved into the earth beneath their homes. They have seen the newsreels showing the German blitzkrieg tearing through Poland, through the Low Countries, through France itself. They understand that invasion is not a matter of if, but when. But there is one man who seems to believe differently. His name is Winston Churchill, and in a speech to Parliament on June 4, 1940, just days after the evacuation from France, he utters words that will echo through history. "We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall never surrender." The people of Britain want to believe him. They need to believe him. But in their hearts, many of them harbor a terrible doubt. How can one small island nation, already economically exhausted by years of defense spending, possibly stand against the Nazi war machine that has just conquered continental Europe? The answer, they are told, rests with the Royal Air Force. Specifically, it rests with one aircraft, the Supermarine Spitfire. Every newspaper in Britain has printed photographs of the Spitfire. Every broadcast has described its sleek, graceful lines. Pilots who have flown the aircraft speak of it in reverent tones, as if describing something almost divine. The Spitfire represents the pinnacle of British engineering. It is faster than anything the Germans possess. It is more maneuverable. It is, the experts assure the nation, the best fighter aircraft in the world. When the German Air Force comes, and everyone knows it will come, it will be the Spitfire that meets them. It will be the Spitfire that defends British airspace. It will be the Spitfire that saves the nation. This is what the newspapers say. This is what the military leadership has said. This is what the British people believe. But this assumption, widely held and deeply believed, contains within it a profound misconception. A misconception that would persist for decades. A misconception that would reshape how history remembers the events of 1940. A misconception that would ensure that one of the most important aircraft ever built would fade into obscurity, while its less decisive companion achieved immortal fame. The truth is more complicated, more interesting, and far more revealing about how modern warfare actually works. The man who refused to follow convention. To understand this truth, we must go back several years to a time when war seemed still distant, when Britain was not yet desperate, when men of vision could still think about the future without the crushing weight of immediate survival pressing down upon them. In the early 1930s, the Royal Air Force was still dominated by biplanes. These aircraft, with their multiple wings and intricate bracing struts, had proven their worth in the First World War. They were stable. They were maneuverable. They had captured the imagination of a generation of pilots who had learned to fight in these machines. And aviation convention held that biplanes were the natural evolution of fighter aircraft design. But into this world of accepted wisdom stepped a man named Sidney Cam. Cam was the chief designer at Hawker Aircraft, a company with a distinguished history of building fighter aircraft. Hawker had produced some of the most celebrated biplanes of the previous decade. The company's reputation was built on excellence in the design of these conventional aircraft. Yet Cam possessed something that many conventional engineers lack: the ability to see that conventional wisdom can be wrong. In the early 1930s, as he studied the evolution of aviation around the world, Cam became convinced of something that aviation experts were only beginning to whisper about. The future of fighter aircraft lay not in biplanes, but in monoplanes. A single wing, he theorized, could be designed to be as strong as two wings, but with dramatically reduced weight and air resistance. The advantages in speed, climb rate, and overall performance would be enormous. This was not heretical thinking. Other designers around the world were coming to similar conclusions, but it was radical within the context of British aviation in the early 1930s. To suggest that Hawker should abandon the biplane design that had made them famous seemed almost like betrayal of the company's core identity. But Cam pressed forward. Beginning in the early 1930s, he began preliminary work on a monoplane fighter design. He called the project simply F-36-34, referring to the Air Ministry specification it was designed to meet. He worked quietly, building consensus within Hawker for this radical departure. He built mock-ups, he ran calculations, he convinced the company's leadership that the future belonged to monoplanes. The design that emerged from this process would become the Hawker Hurricane. But it is crucial to understand that the Hurricane was not designed as the most advanced fighter aircraft possible. It was designed with a different philosophy in mind. Sidney Cam, in his engineering wisdom, made a series of deliberate choices that would have profound consequences. He chose a construction method that was slightly older and less advanced than what the most cutting-edge designers were using at other companies. While designers at Supermarine, working on the Spitfire, were developing revolutionary welded aluminum structures and exotic construction techniques, Cam chose a more conventional approach. The Hurricane's fuselage would be built using a Warren Truss box girder construction, a steel tube framework with duralumin cross-bracing held together with rivets rather than welding. This method was proven. It was reliable. It was well understood by manufacturing engineers. Most importantly, it could be produced by workers without the specialized training and equipment that more advanced construction methods required. This was not a choice born of lack of imagination. It was a choice born of profound engineering wisdom. The recognition that in a future war, the ability to produce large numbers of reliable aircraft quickly would matter more than the ability to produce a small number of perfectly optimized aircraft slowly. When Cam submitted his design to the British Air Ministry in 1934, the response was gratifying. The Air Ministry had issued specification F-36-34 precisely to find an advanced monoplane fighter. Cam's design met every requirement. It exceeded many of them. The Air Ministry was impressed enough to order prototypes. But then, Hawker Aircraft made a decision that would have enormous consequences. Before receiving a formal production contract, before even knowing if the RAF would want to build the aircraft in significant numbers, Hawker began retooling its factories for mass production of the Hurricane. The company was betting its future on this aircraft. The company was betting that the specification would prove correct, that the Air Ministry would want to build hundreds of these planes, that the design would work. It was a bold gamble, but it was also a calculation based on a deep understanding of the likely future. If war came, and by the mid-1930s, many people could see that war was likely, then Britain would need aircraft, lots of them, not a few perfect aircraft, but many reliable ones. The first flight was a new era begins. On November 6, 1935, at Brooklands Aerodrome in Surrey, a test pilot named George Bullman settled himself into the cockpit of the prototype Hurricane. The aircraft was unprepossessing in appearance, nothing like the elegant, streamlined aircraft that would emerge later. But as Bullman pushed the throttle forward and the aircraft began its takeoff roll, something remarkable happened. The Hurricane climbed into the sky above Surrey, and what Bullman discovered in that first flight was that the design worked. The aircraft was stable. The controls were responsive. Most importantly, it was fast. When Bullman put the aircraft through its paces that November day, he discovered that it exceeded 300 miles per hour in level flight. It was the first British fighter aircraft to achieve this speed. This was an astonishing performance. The Hurricane was not yet a refined design. There would be many modifications over the following years. But from that first moment in the air, it was clear that CAM had created something that worked. The Air Ministry's response was swift. In June of 1936, an order came through for 600 Hurricanes. This was not a tentative order for a few aircraft to see if the design would work. This was a massive order, signaling the Air Ministry's profound confidence in the design. And Hawker, which had already begun manufacturing preparation, was ready to fulfill it. Over the next few years, as relations between Britain and Nazi Germany deteriorated, as the Japanese invaded China, as the Spanish Civil War raged and both fascist and democratic powers tested their military theories against each other, the Hurricane entered service with the Royal Air Force. Squadron after squadron received the new fighter. Pilots flew the aircraft and came away impressed by its handling, its reliability, and its performance. By 1938, as the Munich crisis created a moment of supreme tension between Britain and Germany, over 300 Hurricanes were already operational with the RAF. The aircraft had proven itself in squadron service. But few people truly understood what the Hurricane represented. Few people grasped that they were looking at the aircraft that would determine the outcome of the coming war.
Because by this point, everyone was looking at something else. The glamorous alternative. In the same year that the Hurricane first flew, 1935, another aircraft made its first flight. This aircraft was produced by Supermarine, a company with its own distinguished aviation history. The aircraft was called the Spitfire. Where the Hurricane was solid and conventional, the Spitfire was elegant and revolutionary. Where the Hurricane represented engineering practicality married to reliable design, the Spitfire represented the cutting edge of aeronautical science pushed to its limits. The Spitfire was faster than the Hurricane. It climbed faster. It could maneuver more tightly in certain situations. It represented aircraft design as an art form. Every curve, every surface, every detail of the Spitfire's construction optimized for performance. The Spitfire captured the imagination of the British public in a way the Hurricane never could. The aircraft was beautiful. Photographs of it appeared regularly in newspapers and magazines. Pilots who flew Spitfires spoke of the experience in almost mystical terms. The sensation of piloting an aircraft that seemed almost alive, that responded to every input with perfect precision. Test pilots who evaluated the Spitfire reported that it handled like a dream. The Air Ministry ordered Spitfires too, but in smaller numbers than the Hurricanes. The Spitfire was more expensive to produce. It required more specialized manufacturing techniques. It was a more demanding aircraft for pilots to learn on. It could be less forgiving than the Hurricane for a pilot who made mistakes. But it was the aircraft that captured hearts. It was the aircraft that inspired. It was the aircraft that symbolized British technological achievement. As the 1930s drew to a close, and the Second World War drew inexorably closer, there emerged a clear division in British aviation culture. The Spitfire was the glamorous fighter, the aircraft of the future, the symbol of British excellence. The Hurricane was solid, reliable, proven, but somehow less exciting. Journalists wrote more about the Spitfire. Pilots aspired to fly the Spitfire. When the newspapers imagined the coming air war, they imagined Spitfires fighting German fighters. The Hurricane, meanwhile, was relegated to a secondary role in the public imagination. Yes, it was a good fighter. Yes, it would have a role to play. But when people thought about the air defense of Britain, when they imagined the battle that would determine their nation's survival, they thought of the Spitfire. This assumption would prove to be one of the great historical misconceptions.
While British aviation experts were debating the relative merits of their fighters, German designers were creating their own aircraft. The German fighter of the era was the Messerschmitt Bf 109. This aircraft was, by most technical measures, an excellent fighter. It was fast. It could climb quickly. It had good armament. German designers had focused on creating an aircraft that excelled in the qualities that German military doctrine demanded: speed, climb rate, and the ability to deliver concentrated firepower. The Bf 109 was superior to the Spitfire in some respects. It could climb faster. In a dive, it could accelerate more quickly. In certain combat scenarios, it was deadlier. German pilots who flew the Bf 109 were confident in their aircraft. They had proven its worth in the Spanish Civil War, where German pilots flying Bf 109s had engaged Republican aircraft and emerged victorious. The German military aviation doctrine was based on the superiority of the Bf 109. But when German military planners thought about a potential war with Britain, they did not spend much time thinking about the Bf 109's abilities relative to the Hurricane. The Hurricane was barely on their radar. German intelligence reports on British aircraft focused on the Spitfire. German planning assumed that if air combat came, it would be the Bf 109 against the Spitfire. German pilots expected to face Spitfires. German strategy was built around the assumption that the air war over Britain, if it came, would be decided in combat between the Bf 109 and the Spitfire. German planners, looking at the specifications of the two aircraft, believed the Bf 109 would prevail. The Bf 109 was faster in level flight. It could climb more quickly. These seemed like decisive advantages. What German military planners did not calculate was the degree to which a war is decided not by the performance of individual aircraft, but by the entire system within which those aircraft operate. By the time war came in September of 1939, the stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not just the fate of Britain, but the course of the entire Second World War. And waiting in the wings was an aircraft that almost no one, on either side, fully understood. September 1939. The war begins. When Britain declared war on Nazi Germany on September 3, 1939, the RAF had operational strength of approximately 720 fighter aircraft. Of these, roughly 450 were Hurricanes. The remaining aircraft were divided among Spitfires, older biplane fighters still in service, and a handful of experimental designs. The Hurricane, despite being designed only a few years earlier, had already become the backbone of British fighter strength. 30 RAF squadrons were equipped with Hurricanes. 19 squadrons flew Spitfires. Every other fighter type combined numbered fewer squadrons than the Hurricane possessed. This fact, seemingly obvious to anyone who examined the RAF's order of battle, somehow failed to penetrate the public consciousness. In the minds of the British people, the Spitfire remained the primary defender of their nation. The Hurricane remained secondary.
The first blood of the air war was drawn, appropriately, by a hurricane. On October 30th, 1939, nearly 2 months into the war, pilot officer P.W.O. Mold of No. 1 Squadron, flying a Hawker Hurricane, was on patrol above France when he encountered a German Dornier Do-17 bomber. In a brief engagement, Mold positioned his Hurricane behind the German aircraft and opened fire with the Hurricane's 8 Browning machine guns. The German bomber, struck by the concentrated fire from Mold's weapons, was unable to escape. The aircraft fell from the sky and crashed to the ground. It was the first air victory for the RAF in the Second World War. And it had been achieved not by a pilot in a Spitfire, but by a pilot in a Hurricane, the aircraft that most of the British public considered secondary.
But this was merely a prelude to what would come. Over the winter of 1939 and into the spring of 1940, as Hitler's armies prepared for their assault on Western Europe, RAF Hurricanes were being deployed to France in ever-increasing numbers. Pilots who flew the aircraft over France began to gain experience in actual combat against German aircraft. And what they were discovering was challenging everything that aviation experts believed about fighter aircraft. The Hurricane, on paper, was inferior to the German Bf-109 in almost every important metric. It was slower in level flight. It could not climb as quickly. It could not dive as quickly. By every measure of pure performance, the Bf-109 was the superior aircraft. And yet, in the skies over France, Hurricanes were achieving victories against Bf-109s. Pilots were discovering that the Hurricane had qualities that no performance chart could fully capture. The story of the Hawker Hurricane was just beginning.
May 1940, the German offensive begins. The spring of 1940 arrives with deceptive calm. In Britain, despite the ongoing war, life proceeds with a kind of orderly predictability. The conflict with Germany has lasted through the winter with little dramatic action. Newspapers speak of the phony war, a period where nations are officially at war, but no major battles have been fought. Some people begin to wonder if war can be avoided entirely, if Hitler might be contained through diplomatic pressure, if the worst can somehow be prevented. This illusion shatters on May 10, 1940. On this date, the German Wehrmacht launches Operation Fallgelb, Case Yellow, a massive assault on the Low Countries in France. The blitzkrieg tactics that had been theorized in military academies and tested in limited fashion in Poland are now unleashed with their full devastating power. German panzer divisions, moving with astonishing speed, pour through Belgium and the Netherlands. The French army, positioned along the Maginot Line in static defense, suddenly finds its carefully prepared positions rendered irrelevant by German forces flowing around them through terrain they thought impassable. Within 3 days, German forces have penetrated deep into Belgium and France. Within a week, they have shattered French defensive lines. Within 2 weeks, the Battle of France has become a rout. And it is in this chaos, in this collapse of military order, that the Hawker Hurricane experiences its first true test in sustained combat. RAF squadrons operating in France are thrown into desperate air battles against the Luftwaffe. These are not the carefully planned, almost civilized air engagements of the Winter War. These are frantic, confused dogfights where pilots are flying multiple sorties per day, landing to refuel and rearm, then taking off immediately to engage German aircraft again. The intensity of the air combat is unlike anything the RAF has experienced before. The pilots who fly Hurricanes during this period are men in their 20s. Most of them have never seen combat before May 1940. They have trained in peacetime conditions. They have practiced formation flying and gunnery on ranges. They have studied the theory of air combat, but nothing has truly prepared them for the reality of facing an opponent who is trying to kill them, who has experience from months of flying in Spain and the Polish campaign, who is flying an aircraft that, on paper, appears to be superior. Squadron leader Peter Townsend, flying a Hurricane with 43rd Squadron, experiences his first combat on May 10, 1940. Later, he would write about the shock of that first encounter. The carefully planned tactics that look so good on a briefing room blackboard dissolve the moment guns start firing. The formation breaks apart. Suddenly, Townsend finds himself alone in a vast sky, searching the clouds for enemy aircraft, knowing that the next shape that emerges might be a German fighter attempting to shoot him out of the sky.
Townsend survives that day. Over the following weeks, he will become one of the leading Hurricane pilots in France, accumulating victories against German aircraft, learning through brutal experience the tactics that work and the tactics that get pilots killed. What pilots like Townsend survives that day? Over the following weeks, he will become one of the leading hurricane pilots in France, accumulating victories against German aircraft, learning through brutal experience the tactics that work and the tactics that get pilots killed. What pilots like Townsend begin to discover in these desperate combats over France is a truth that will reshape everything that aviation experts believe about fighter aircraft. The Hurricane, despite being slower than the Bf-109 on paper, is proving to be extremely difficult to shoot down. More than that, in certain tactical situations, the Hurricane is proving to be superior to the German fighter. The key to this unexpected superiority lies in a characteristic that no performance chart fully captures: the turning radius of the aircraft. The Hawker Hurricane, with its relatively thick wing and more conservative aerodynamic design, possesses an exceptional ability to turn tightly. The wing, which generates less aerodynamic lift than the more advanced wing on the Spitfire, nevertheless generates sufficient lift to allow the Hurricane to maintain a turn at angles that would cause the Bf-109 to stall out. This means that a Hurricane pilot, when chased by a Bf-109, can pull back on the control stick and turn tightly in a way that a German pilot cannot follow without stalling or risking the structural integrity of the aircraft. This discovery, that turning ability matters as much as straight-line speed, begins to emerge in the combat reports filed by RAF pilots during the French campaign. Pilots begin to develop tactics based on this understanding. When a Bf-109 dives on a Hurricane from above, attempting to use its speed advantage to gain a firing position, the Hurricane pilot pulls back on the stick and turns tightly. The German aircraft, unable to follow, overshoots and finds itself in front of the Hurricane instead of behind it. The tactical advantage reverses. Flying Officer James Lacey is another Hurricane pilot who learns this lesson during the French campaign. Lacey will eventually become one of the top-scoring RAF pilots of the entire war, and he owes much of his success to understanding the Hurricane's turning ability and how to use it against faster opponents. In his combat reports, Lacey describes repeatedly employing this tactic, allowing the Bf-109 to dive on him, then turning sharply to force the German aircraft into an overshoot, then getting behind the German aircraft to deliver a burst of machine gun fire. But there is more to the Hurricane's effectiveness than turning ability alone: the firepower question.
The Hawker Hurricane carries 8 .303-inch Browning machine guns, all mounted in the wings. These are not powerful weapons by the standards of later aircraft. They fire the same cartridge used by British infantry rifles. But they fire a tremendous volume of ammunition. Each gun fires approximately 1,200 rounds per minute when in full automatic fire. In the hands of a pilot who understands gunnery, who has trained extensively in deflection shooting, who knows how to position himself to deliver effective fire, this volume of ammunition can be devastating. A pilot who gets behind the German aircraft and holds his finger on the firing button can deliver a stream of machine gun bullets that is almost impossible to escape. The German Bf-109, particularly the early versions encountered in 1940, carries cannon armament, weapons that fire larger projectiles at a slower rate. In terms of hitting power per round, the cannon is superior. But in terms of sheer volume of fire, the Hurricane's machine guns deliver more ammunition in a given time period. And in dogfighting, where engagements are often brief and confused, the ability to deliver a rapid, overwhelming stream of fire can be decisive. German pilots who face Hurricanes during the French campaign begin to report this in their combat assessments. They note that the Hurricane, while slower and unable to outdive them, is difficult to shoot down because of its exceptional turning ability. They also note the devastating effect of the Hurricane's machine guns when a German pilot makes a mistake and allows a Hurricane pilot to get behind him. The collapse. France falls. But even these tactical advantages cannot overcome the sheer military reality unfolding on the ground in France during May and June of 1940. The German army is advancing with terrifying speed. French military command, unprepared for the speed and coordination of the German blitzkrieg, is in a state of growing chaos. RAF squadrons operating from airfields in France are under constant threat of being cut off. Pilots are flying multiple combat sorties per day, often in conditions of extreme fatigue. Ground crews are exhausted. Supply lines are breaking down.
On May 15th, the French military leadership begins to openly discuss the possibility of armistice with Germany. The situation has deteriorated so rapidly that military commanders believe there was no possibility of French victory. By May 20th, German forces have cut off the British Expeditionary Force in Belgium. By May 28th, the Belgian army surrenders. The British are trapped. The only escape route is through the French port of Dunkirk. During these final days of the campaign in France, RAF pilots continue to fly Hurricanes in desperate defense of the retreating British forces. They are outnumbered. They are exhausted. They are flying from increasingly difficult conditions as airfields fall to advancing German forces. Many pilots who had trained their entire peacetime careers are killed during this period. The RAF loses aircraft at a rate that seems unsustainable. By June 4, 1940, the evacuation from Dunkirk is complete. Over 330,000 British and French soldiers have been rescued from the beaches by a makeshift fleet of naval vessels, commercial ships, and small boats crewed by civilian volunteers. It is a military disaster, transformed into a kind of triumph by the courage of ordinary people. But it is a triumph built on defeat. The British Expeditionary Force has lost virtually all its heavy equipment. British forces have suffered hundreds of thousands of casualties, and now Britain stands alone. Flying Officer George Unwin, a Hurricane pilot with 19 Squadron, participates in the final evacuation. He flies multiple sorties over the Dunkirk beaches, attacking German aircraft and providing close air support for the retreating forces below. In one engagement, Unwin is credited with shooting down 3 German Bf-109s in a single sortie. But when he lands back at his airfield and steps out of the Hurricane, he is shaking with exhaustion and the emotional toll of repeated combat. This is the moment that Unwin, like so many pilots, begins to understand the true nature of what is coming. France is about to surrender. Britain will soon stand alone against Nazi Germany, and the battle that will determine whether that island nation survives will be fought in the skies above British territory. Everything that has happened in France has been, in a sense, a preparation for the coming storm.
The evacuation of the RAF. As French resistance collapses and the evacuation from France is underway, RAF leadership makes a critical decision to withdraw remaining squadrons from France back to Britain. This decision is not made easily. Many RAF officers feel loyalty to the French military. Many believe that withdrawing RAF squadrons will further demoralize already broken French forces. But military necessity demands it. The RAF cannot afford to lose its remaining squadrons to continued combat in France. Between May 20th and June 20th, 1940, the RAF conducts a fighting retreat back to Britain. Squadrons operating from French airfields fly final sorties, then evacuate to airfields across the English Channel. The pilots who have spent weeks in desperate combat over France return home with a new understanding of what they face. What these pilots bring back to Britain is invaluable experience. They have fought the Luftwaffe in sustained air combat. They have learned the strengths and weaknesses of German aircraft. They've discovered that the Hurricane, despite technical inferiority in certain respects, is a formidable fighter aircraft. They have learned tactics that work and tactics that get pilots killed. And they have learned something perhaps even more important, the psychological factor of combat. A pilot who has seen another aircraft get shot down, who has felt the fear of a cannon shell passing through his aircraft, who has had to bail out and parachute down to earth, is a different person than the peacetime pilot he was before. He is more wary. He is more experienced.
He is more likely to survive the next engagement because he has already survived impossible odds. Squadron leader Robert Stanford Tuck, flying Hurricanes with 92 Squadron, emerges from the French campaign as one of the most experienced pilots in the RAF. Tuck has accumulated multiple victories against German aircraft. More importantly, Tuck has learned how to survive. He will go on to become one of the top-scoring RAF pilots of the entire war, and much of his success is built on the lessons learned in the desperate skies over France. Regrouping and realization. By the end of June 1940, the RAF squadrons have been withdrawn to Britain and are attempting to regroup and rebuild. The losses of the French campaign have been severe. The RAF has lost over 400 aircraft, with significant pilot casualties. But the surviving pilots and aircraft represent the core of British air defense, and they have something that German pilots do not have: recent experience in sustained combat against the Luftwaffe. As Hurricane squadrons prepare defensive positions across the British Isles, as radar stations begin to come online to provide early warning of German attacks, as pilots study maps showing the expected invasion routes that German aircraft will take, there is a grim awareness of what is to come.
The German Air Force is preparing for what it calls Unternehmen Adlerangriff, the Eagle attack, a massive air offensive designed to destroy the RAF and achieve air superiority over Britain within weeks. German planners believe this will take perhaps 2 weeks. After the RAF is destroyed, German air superiority will allow German forces to invade Britain with impunity. German military calculations are based on the assumption that they can destroy the RAF through attrition. The Luftwaffe has roughly twice as many aircraft as the RAF. If aircraft losses are roughly equal, then the RAF will be destroyed first simply because it starts with fewer aircraft. This logic seems sound to German military planners. What they have not calculated is the degree to which the nature of a war changes when it is fought over home territory. The home field advantage. This is a crucial point that German military planners have overlooked. The RAF is not fighting over enemy territory. The RAF is fighting over Britain. This changes everything. When a German aircraft is shot down over Britain, the pilot is captured, if they survive the crash, or killed. The aircraft is lost forever. German pilots have no margin for survival. Every engagement over British territory could be their last. When a British aircraft is shot down over Britain, the situation is entirely different. If the pilot survives the crash and manages to escape the wreckage, he may live to fight another day. Ground crews will scramble to find him. If he is injured, British medical services will treat him. If he is captured, at least he survives the war. The aircraft may be lost, but there is a chance the pilot will be recovered. This creates a vast psychological and strategic advantage for the defending side. A German Bf 109 pilot flying over Britain knows that if his aircraft is damaged, he faces a long flight back across the channel, possibly with hydraulic systems damaged, possibly with one engine struggling, possibly wounded. Many Bf 109 pilots who are shot down over Britain are never recovered because they ditch in the channel and are lost at sea. German pilots begin to understand that flying over Britain is extraordinarily dangerous in a way that flying over French territory was not. RAF pilots, by contrast, know that even if their aircraft is damaged, they can attempt to return to an airfield in Britain. Even if they have to bail out, they are over friendly territory. Ground troops will help them escape capture. They will likely return to flying status within days or weeks. This psychological factor cannot be captured in any performance chart, but it is no less real than any technical specification. The preparations, waiting for the storm. As June transitions into July 1940, RAF squadrons equipped with Hurricanes take up defensive positions around Britain. Airfields across the south and east of England host Hurricane squadrons. Pilots stand ready, waiting for the German assault that everyone knows is coming.
The Hurricane squadrons have been reinforced by new pilots fresh from training schools. These pilots have not experienced combat. They are nervous, eager, and trying desperately to learn from the experienced pilots who have fought in France. The experienced pilots, in turn, take on an almost mentor-like role, trying to pass on hard-won knowledge to the next generation of defenders. The aircraft themselves are being continuously maintained and improved. New aircraft are rolling off production lines. Older aircraft are being retrofitted with improved components. Ammunition is being stockpiled. Fuel is being stored. Everything is being prepared for the coming battle. But there is a constraint that British military planners are acutely aware of: production. The Spitfire is an aircraft that requires enormous resources to produce. It is complex. It requires skilled workers and specialized manufacturing processes. Production rates are slow. Every Spitfire produced is a significant investment of national resources. By the summer of 1940, British aircraft factories are producing perhaps 30 or 40 Spitfires per week. The Hurricane, by contrast, is being produced at a much faster rate. The simpler construction methods, the proven manufacturing processes, the less demanding component specifications, all of this means that Hurricanes can be built faster. By the summer of 1940, production rates for Hurricanes are running at perhaps 50 or 60 aircraft per week and climbing. This difference in production rate will prove to be absolutely crucial to the outcome of the coming battle. The last days of July. As July 1940 draws to a close, German military planners finalize their plans for the Eagle attack. The operation will commence in early August. The RAF will be destroyed. Air superiority will be achieved. Britain will be forced to surrender or will be invaded. RAF pilots, sitting in dispersal huts on airfields across southern England, wait for the orders that will send them into combat. The weather is warm and sunny. The summer of 1940 is beautiful, but the beauty of the English countryside is about to become a battlefield. Hurricane pilots clean their weapons. They study tactical diagrams. They discuss the likely German approach routes. They prepare themselves mentally for what is coming. What no one yet realizes is that the Hurricane, the aircraft that most people consider secondary, the aircraft that has been overshadowed by the more glamorous Spitfire, the aircraft that was designed with practicality rather than perfection in mind, is about to prove itself indispensable. The Hurricane is about to become, in the coming weeks and months, the aircraft that saves Britain. The trial by fire over France has been merely a preview. The real test is about to begin.
Spitfires are being produced at a slower rate, approximately 30 to 40 per week, but production is accelerating as manufacturing processes are refined and additional factories come online. The total production of British fighter aircraft in August 1940 is approximately 90 to 100 aircraft per week. The German Luftwaffe, by contrast, is producing new fighter aircraft at a much slower rate. German aircraft production is hampered by a manufacturing base that is not fully organized for total war production, lack of access to certain raw materials due to British blockade, overcomplicated manufacturing processes for the Bf-109 and other German fighters, production of multiple types of aircraft, spreading resources across different programs. German production of Bf-109s in August 1940 is approximately 30 aircraft per week. This means that the RAF is producing new fighter aircraft at a rate roughly 3 times faster than the Luftwaffe is producing fighter aircraft. Moreover, most of these British aircraft are Hurricanes, the aircraft with the superior turning ability that is proving so effective against German bombers. The grinding attrition. Hurricanes' role in survival. As August turns into September and the air battles continue day after day, the strategic picture becomes clearer. The RAF is losing aircraft, but because the production rate is so high, the losses can be replaced. More than that, the total number of serviceable RAF fighters is actually increasing despite daily combat losses because production is outpacing losses. The Luftwaffe is also losing aircraft, but at a rate that is much higher relative to its production capacity. German pilots who are shot down over British territory are lost forever. German aircraft that are destroyed cannot be replaced as quickly as the RAF can replace its losses. The Hurricane plays an absolutely critical role in this strategic dynamic. The Hurricane is cheaper to produce than the Spitfire. The Hurricane requires less specialized manufacturing skill. The Hurricane is produced in greater numbers. And crucially, the Hurricane is proving extraordinarily effective at destroying German bombers, which are the main threat to the British civilian population and military infrastructure. Flying Officer Eric Locke, a Hurricane pilot with 41 Squadron, participates in numerous engagements throughout August and September. Locke is a natural fighter pilot with exceptional gunnery skills. By the end of the Battle of Britain, Locke will have accumulated over 20 victories, many of them in a Hurricane. In his combat reports, Locke describes repeatedly using the Hurricane's turning ability to get behind German bombers and open fire, watching as the German aircraft fall from the sky. Locke's experiences are typical of many Hurricane pilots during the battle. The aircraft is proving to be exactly what its designer, Sidney Cam, had intended: a reliable, practical, producible fighter aircraft that could be built in large numbers and that could accomplish the mission of defending British airspace.
Sergeant George Clay, a Hurricane pilot with 56 Squadron, becomes famous for a particular engagement on August 15, 1940. Clay is flying near the German airfield at Les Touquet when he encounters a formation of German Bf-109s preparing to take off. Clay dives on the formation and shoots down one Bf-109. As he is attempting to escape, he is attacked by other German fighters. His Hurricane is damaged, but Clay manages to fly the damaged aircraft back across the channel and lands at a British airfield with severe damage to his aircraft. The Hurricane, damaged as it is, survives the landing. The aircraft is repaired and returned to service within days. This is another critical advantage of the Hurricane. Its robust construction makes it repairable. Aircraft that might be written off as total losses can often be fixed and returned to service. This further increases the effective strength of the RAF. The second phase, the German adjustment. By mid-August, German military commanders begin to realize that the air war is not proceeding as planned. The RAF has not been destroyed. German bombers are still encountering effective fighter opposition. The attrition rate is proving higher than expected. German strategy begins to shift. German commanders decide to focus on destroying the RAF's fighters rather than focusing on bombing targets. The logic is sound. If the RAF's fighters can be destroyed, then German bombers can operate unopposed. German strategy shifts toward large-scale fighter sweeps, where German fighters deliberately seek out RAF fighters and attempt to draw them into combat where superior numbers can be employed. These German fighter sweeps often involve formations of 50, 100, or even more German Bf-109s flying with the intent of finding RAF fighters and destroying them. The RAF, having fewer fighters, must choose carefully which German sweeps to intercept. Intercepting every German sweep would result in the RAF being overwhelmed by superior numbers. But here again, the Hurricane plays a crucial role. The Hurricane, with its superior turning ability, proves to be an excellent aircraft for one-on-one combat with the Bf-109. When Hurricane pilots are forced to engage German fighters in combat, they often come out ahead because they can turn tighter than the German aircraft and can get into favorable firing positions. Squadron leader Brian Lane, a legendary pilot who will eventually become famous for commanding 66 Squadron, participates in numerous engagements with his Hurricanes during August and September. By mid-August, German military commanders begin to realize that the air war is not proceeding as planned. The RAF has not been destroyed. German bombers are still encountering effective fighter opposition. The attrition rate is proving higher than expected. German strategy begins to shift. German commanders decide to focus on destroying the RAF's fighters rather than focusing on bombing targets. The logic is sound. If the RAF's fighters can be destroyed, then German bombers can operate unopposed. German strategy shifts toward large-scale fighter sweeps, where German fighters deliberately seek out RAF fighters and attempt to draw them into combat where superior numbers can be employed. These German fighter sweeps often involve formations of 50, 100, or even more German Bf-109s, flying with the intent of finding RAF fighters and destroying them. The RAF, having fewer fighters, must choose carefully which German sweeps to intercept. Intercepting every German sweep would result in the RAF being overwhelmed by superior numbers. But here again, the Hurricane plays a crucial role. The Hurricane, with its superior turning ability, proves to be an excellent aircraft for one-on-one combat with the Bf-109. When Hurricane pilots are forced to engage German fighters in combat, they often come out ahead because they can turn tighter than the German aircraft and can get into favorable firing positions. Squadron leader Brian Lane, a legendary pilot who will eventually become famous for commanding 66 Squadron, participates in numerous engagements with his Hurricanes during August and September. Lane discovers that the key to success is understanding the Hurricane's strengths and playing to them. When engaged by a Bf-109, Lane will allow the German aircraft to make the first attack, then use the Hurricane's turning ability to reverse the situation and get behind the German aircraft.
By the end of the day, on August 10, 1940, the battle is over. The German formations have either broken up under RAF attack or have completed their bombing runs on their targets and are retreating back across the Channel. In the evening, at RAF airfields across southern England, pilots are landing back on the grass runways, stepping out of cockpits, and attempting to process what they have experienced. Ground crews are running to meet them, checking aircraft for damage, assessing which aircraft can be quickly repaired and returned to service, which aircraft are damaged beyond quick repair. The official reports begin to come in from the various squadrons. The numbers, when compiled, show that the RAF has shot down approximately 40 German aircraft. German bombers have successfully dropped their bombs on targets in southern England. British airfields have been damaged, but none have been destroyed. RAF losses have been approximately 22 aircraft. British pilot casualties have been relatively light, with several pilots bailing out and returning to their squadrons. From a British perspective, the day is not a defeat. The RAF has survived. The bomber stream has been attacked and scattered. German air superiority has not been achieved on the first day. From a German perspective, the day is concerning. The losses are higher than expected. German bombers have not achieved the concentration of attack that was planned. The RAF has proven more capable of intercepting the bombing raids than German intelligence suggested. But more importantly, something else has become clear. The air war is not going to be decided quickly. It is not going to be decided in a few days, as German planners had hoped. It is going to be a prolonged engagement, where losses accumulate, where attrition becomes the determining factor. The critical advantage: production rates. As August progresses and the air battles continue day after day, a critical dynamic begins to emerge. The RAF is losing aircraft. At current rates of attrition, within a few weeks or months, the RAF will have no serviceable fighters left. German planners believe this is inevitable. The German Air Force has roughly twice as many aircraft. If losses are roughly equal, then the RAF will be destroyed first. But what German planners have not fully accounted for is the production rate of the two sides. In August 1940, the RAF is producing new aircraft at a rate that is actually increasing, not decreasing. British aircraft factories now fully mobilized for wartime production are producing Hurricanes at a rate of approximately 50 to 60 aircraft per week. Additional aircraft are being produced in Canada by Canadian Car and Foundry, and these are beginning to arrive in Britain in increasing numbers.
August 10th, 1940. The Eagle attack commences. The summer sky over southern England is brilliant blue. The weather is perfect, visibility unlimited, just a few wispy clouds. Excellent conditions for flying. On airfields across Kent, Sussex, and other counties in southeastern England, RAF pilots sit in dispersal huts, ready to scramble at a moment's notice. Mechanics stand by their aircraft, checking engines, ensuring fuel tanks are full, making sure ammunition is loaded into the 8 machine guns of the Hurricanes and Spitfires waiting on the airfield. At 8 a.m. on August 10, 1940, radar operators at a chain home station on the English coast detect a massive formation of German aircraft approaching from across the English Channel. The signal is immediately passed to RAF fighter control centers. At these nerve centers, experienced officers begin plotting the incoming raid. They calculate the size, speed, and likely target of the German formation. They calculate which squadrons should be scrambled to meet the threat. Within minutes, scramble orders reach the dispersal huts. Pilots who have been sitting and waiting suddenly leap to their feet. They sprint to their aircraft. Ground crew assist them into the cockpits, helping them strap into the seats, checking that all systems are functioning. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engines of the Hurricanes and Spitfires cough to life, smoke and flame erupting from the exhausts as the pilots run up their engines. One by one, aircraft begin to taxi from their parking positions toward the runway. The vibration of thousands of horsepower, building to full throttle, sends a tremor through the entire airfield. The first aircraft reaches the end of the runway, the pilot pushes the throttle to the maximum, and the Hurricane or Spitfire accelerates down the grass runway, bouncing over the uneven surface, building speed, and finally, in that moment when speed reaches approximately 80 miles per hour, lifts off into the air. Seconds later, another aircraft is accelerating down the runway, then another, then another. Within minutes, an entire squadron of 12 to 16 fighters is airborne, climbing toward altitude, their pilots straining their necks to scan the sky for the enemy. This is the moment that aviation historians call the beginning of the Battle of Britain. This is not a date that was chosen by either side. It is simply the date that the Germans decided to launch Unternehmen Adlerangriff in full scale. The sporadic raids of July have become a coordinated, systematic air offensive designed to destroy the RAF and achieve air superiority over British territory. What the RAF pilots climbing into the August sky do not yet know is that they are beginning to participate in what will become the longest, most sustained air campaign that the world has ever witnessed. The battle will last for months. It will cost hundreds of lives. It will determine the future of the war. And the aircraft that will prove most important in defending Britain will not be the glamorous Spitfire that the public believes will save them. It will be the Hurricane. The first wave, understanding the magnitude.
As RAF pilots climb to altitude, typically to around 20,000 feet, the altitude at which German bombers typically approach, they begin to comprehend the magnitude of what they face. Squadron leader Alec Cunningham, leading 87 Squadron's Hurricanes out of an airfield near Biggin Hill, describes seeing German aircraft stretching across the entire sky ahead of him. Not just dozens, not just hundreds. The formation extends almost from one horizon to the other, a seemingly endless stream of German bombers, escorted by German fighters. The German formation consists of approximately 250 aircraft. At the front and flanks are Messerschmitt Bf-109s, approximately 100 of them, providing fighter escort for the bombers. Behind them are Heinkel He-111 bombers and Dornier Do-17 bombers, approximately 150 aircraft in total, laden with bombs, flying in tight formation for mutual defense. Against this formation, the RAF is sending perhaps 30 to 40 fighters. The mathematics of this encounter are brutal. The RAF has roughly 1 fighter for every 5 German aircraft. The German formation is designed specifically to create a defensive formation. The bomber formation itself is intended to be defended by the machine guns of all the bombers, with each bomber's guns providing mutual cover for the others. The escorting fighters then provide additional protection against RAF attacks from certain angles. This is air combat doctrine that has been developed and refined over years of warfare in Spain and Poland. It represents the cumulative experience of the Luftwaffe facing enemy fighters. Against this doctrine, the RAF is opposing formations of fighters attempting to break through the German escort and get to the bombers. The collision between the two forces is almost literally a collision. Aircraft approach each other at a combined speed of perhaps 800 miles per hour. The encounter lasts minutes at most. In those minutes, the pilots must identify specific targets in the chaos of multiple aircraft, maneuver to get behind or alongside their target, position themselves to deliver fire, avoid being shot down by German fighters or bomber defensive fire, escape without colliding with other aircraft, attempt to return to their airfield.
It is a task that requires split-second timing, years of training, the ability to remain calm under extreme stress, and an enormous amount of luck. The first combats, Hurricanes against the bombers. The first encounters of August 10th involve squadrons of Hurricanes attacking the German bomber stream while Spitfires attempt to hold off the German fighter escort. What becomes immediately apparent in these first engagements is that the Hurricane is exceptionally effective against the German bombers. The 8 machine guns of the Hurricane, when they score hits on a German bomber, deliver concentrated fire that tears the aircraft apart. German bombers like the Heinkel 111 are large, relatively slow-moving aircraft with limited maneuverability. They're designed to carry bombs and fly in formation, not to engage in individual air combat. When a Hurricane pilot maneuvers into position behind or alongside a German bomber and opens fire, the effect is devastating. A burst of machine gun fire can shred the fuselage, puncture fuel tanks, damage engines, wound crew members. Multiple hits can cause structural failure that brings the aircraft down. Pilot Officer George Unwin, the same pilot who distinguished himself over France and over Dunkirk, is flying a Hurricane in 19 Squadron on August 10th. Unwin maneuvered into firing position on a Heinkel 111 that is attempting to escape by ditching toward the sea. Unwin opens fire from a range of perhaps 200 yards, holding the firing button down, sending a stream of bullets into the German aircraft. The Heinkel is struck repeatedly. Smoke begins to trail from one engine, then from both engines. The aircraft becomes difficult to control, difficult to maintain altitude. Unwin continues firing, his Hurricane's engine screaming at full power as he chases the damaged German bomber. At the last moment, the Heinkel's pilot attempts to escape by ditching in the sea. The aircraft crashes into the water with tremendous force. The crew, if any survive the impact, will have to depend on rescue. Unwin, his ammunition expended, breaks off the engagement and attempts to find his way back to an airfield. It is his first victory on August 10th. Before the day is over, he will shoot down more German aircraft.
Across the sky, similar scenes are playing out. Hurricanes finding German bombers, maneuvering into firing position, opening fire, and watching as the German aircraft fall from the sky. The Hurricane's turning ability, that same quality that had proven effective in France, is proving decisive in these encounters. German bombers attempting to escape cannot turn as tightly as a Hurricane. The Hurricane pilot maneuvers to get behind them, and from that position it is almost impossible for the German pilot to escape. Flight Lieutenant Richard Jones, commanding 238 Squadron's Hurricanes, participates in multiple engagements on August 10th. In one engagement, Jones maneuvers into position on a Dornier Do-17, attacks from close range, and watches as the German aircraft is struck repeatedly by his machine gun fire. The Dornier structure, stressed by the concentrated fire, begins to come apart in the air. Pieces of the fuselage fall away. The aircraft becomes uncontrollable. As the battle progresses through the morning of August 10th, a pattern becomes increasingly clear. The RAF's Hurricanes are extraordinarily effective at shooting down German bombers. In engagement after engagement, when Hurricanes get into firing position on German bombers, the result is almost inevitably the destruction of the German aircraft. The Spitfire and the Bf-109, a different struggle. While Hurricanes are having devastating success against German bombers, the situation between RAF Spitfires and German Bf-109 fighters is more complicated. The Spitfire, being faster and more agile than the Bf-109 in certain respects, proves to be an excellent fighter for the interceptions it participates in. Spitfire pilots discover that they can get into favorable positions against German fighters and deliver devastating fire. But the Bf-109, particularly the later variants like the Bf-109E, is itself a formidable fighter. It is faster in level flight. It can climb more quickly than the Spitfire. In certain tactical situations, the Bf-109 has advantages. Pilots on both sides learn quickly. German pilots learn to avoid engaging Spitfires in turning fights, where the Spitfire's superior maneuverability gives it an advantage. Instead, German pilots use their aircraft's speed advantage to maintain altitude and energy, employing diving and climbing maneuvers where the Bf-109's superior rate of climb and dive speed give them the advantage. RAF Spitfire pilots learn to avoid prolonged chases of Bf-109s, because if they are drawn into a chase away from the bomber stream, they can become separated and vulnerable to bouncing attacks by other German fighters. The best tactic is to engage briefly, deliver fire if possible, then disengage and return to protect the bomber stream. But because there are fewer Spitfires than Hurricanes, and because the Spitfires are being concentrated on protecting the bomber stream from fighter attack, the Hurricanes are given more freedom to attack the bombers themselves. The result is that the Hurricanes are able to attack with less interference from German fighters. The cost of battle. August 10th results.
Late September and October. As September transitions into October 1940, the intensity of the air battle over Britain begins to change. The massive daylight raids that characterized August and early September become less frequent. The Luftwaffe, having suffered enormous losses and failed to achieve air superiority, begins to shift tactics. German commanders make a strategic decision. Instead of continuing large-scale bomber raids during daylight hours, the Luftwaffe will transition to night bombing raids. Night bombing presents a different challenge for the RAF. The radar systems that have proven so effective at vectoring fighters to daylight raids are less useful at night. Individual aircraft cannot be precisely targeted in darkness. The battle takes on a different character entirely. But before the transition to night bombing is complete, the daylight air battles continue. Throughout late September and all of October 1940, RAF Hurricanes and Spitfires continue to intercept German aircraft attempting daylight bombing raids on British cities and industrial targets. On September 27th, pilot officer James Lacey, the same pilot who had proven himself in France and early in the Battle of Britain, participates in an engagement against a large formation of German bombers. Lacey, flying a Hurricane, maneuvers into position on a German Henkel H-111 bomber. He opens fire from close range, his 8 machine guns blazing. The German bomber is struck repeatedly, smoke pouring from damaged engines. Lacey continues firing, maintaining his position behind the German aircraft, sending a constant stream of ammunition into the German fuselage. The Henkel, unable to escape due to the hurricane's superior turning ability, falls toward the earth. By the time Lacey breaks off the engagement, the German bomber is descending rapidly, trailing smoke, clearly doomed to crash. It is one of many victories that Lacey achieves during the Battle of Britain, and nearly all of them are achieved in a Hawker hurricane. Throughout October, the pattern continues. Hurricanes attack German bomber formations. Spitfires attempt to hold off German fighter escorts. The attrition continues. German losses continue to exceed German production rates. RAF losses, while severe, are being replaced by production and by the continued allocation of aircraft to the battle. The crisis point, mid-October 1940.
By mid-October 1940, the RAF reaches what military historians now recognize as its most critical moment. The pilot loss rate has been extraordinary. RAF pilots killed, wounded, or captured have mounted to over 400 in the first 2 months of the battle. This represents a significant fraction of the RAF's operational pilot strength. New pilots, fresh from training schools, are being sent to squadrons to replace the losses. But these new pilots lack the experience of the veterans. They lack the understanding of tactics that work. They lack the psychological preparation for combat. As a result, new pilots experience significantly higher casualty rates than experienced pilots. Some new pilots are shot down on their first or second operational sortie. The strain on the RAF is becoming visible. Some squadrons, after weeks of intense combat and heavy losses, are showing signs of fatigue. Pilots are exhausted. Ground crews are exhausted. The constant pressure of flying multiple sorties per day, of seeing fellow pilots killed or wounded, of knowing that the next scramble could be the one that gets you shot down, this creates a psychological pressure that is difficult to measure but is absolutely real. Air Vice Admiral Keith Park, commanding RAF Fighter Command in the south of England, is acutely aware of this strain. Park is one of the most capable commanders of the RAF, with a deep understanding of fighter tactics and air defense. Park understands that the RAF is approaching a critical point. If the Luftwaffe can continue intensive operations for another few weeks, if the pilot losses continue at the current rate, the RAF might indeed be defeated through sheer attrition. But Park also understands something about the German Air Force that many others do not. Park, through captured German documents and through intelligence reports, understands that the Luftwaffe is also struggling. German losses have been even more severe than RAF losses in absolute numbers. German pilot losses have been very high. German bombers have been shot down in such numbers that new bomber production cannot keep pace. The Luftwaffe is reaching its own crisis point. The statistics begin to emerge. The real story.
As historians and statisticians began to compile the records of the Battle of Britain in the weeks and months after the battle ended, a remarkable pattern emerged in the data. The RAF had claimed to have shot down over 1,000 German aircraft during the Battle of Britain. This was an exaggeration. The actual figure was closer to 600 to 700 aircraft destroyed or so damaged that they were written off. But even this actual figure represented an extraordinary loss rate for the German Air Force. When the statistics were broken down by aircraft type, another remarkable pattern emerged. Approximately 60% of all German aircraft destroyed during the Battle of Britain had been shot down by Hawker hurricanes. Think about that figure for a moment. 60%. The Spitfire, the aircraft that had captured the imagination of the British public, the aircraft that everyone believed was the primary defender of Britain, had accounted for approximately 40% of German aircraft destroyed. This was not because the Spitfire was inferior. The Spitfire was an excellent aircraft, and Spitfire pilots had achieved remarkable successes, particularly against German fighters. But there were fewer Spitfires than Hurricanes. And the Hurricanes had been given the mission of attacking German bombers, the aircraft that were the primary threat to the British civilian population and military infrastructure. The Hurricane had accomplished this mission with astonishing effectiveness. Flying officer George Unwin, who participated in numerous engagements throughout the battle in his Hurricane, had accumulated over 20 victories by the time the battle ended. In an interview conducted years after the war, Unwin reflected on the Hurricane's effectiveness against bombers. "The Hurricane was perfect for what we were asked to do," Unwin said. "The bombers couldn't escape us. Our machine guns delivered enough firepower to destroy them, and the turning ability allowed us to keep on them even when they tried to escape." The data supported Unwin's assessment. German bomber losses had been catastrophic. Of the approximately 330 German bombers that were destroyed during the Battle of Britain, the vast majority had been shot down by Hurricanes. The Heinkel He-111, the Dornier Do-17, the Junkers Ju-88, all had fallen to Hurricane pilots in much greater numbers than to any other aircraft. The German failure becomes apparent. By late October 1940, it had become absolutely clear to German military commanders that Operation Eagle had failed. The Luftwaffe had not achieved air superiority over Britain. The RAF had not been destroyed. The invasion of Britain could not proceed without air superiority, and air superiority could not be achieved.
German commanders made the decision to end the intensive daylight bombing campaign. Starting in early November, the Luftwaffe shifted almost entirely to night bombing, the Blitz as it would become known. This was a different kind of war. Fighter aircraft could do little against night bombers. The air war over Britain would be different from this point forward. But from the perspective of the Battle of Britain, the daylight air campaign of August through October 1940, the battle was over, and Germany had lost. The RAF had survived. The RAF had defeated the German Air Force. The invasion would not come. Britain would live to fight another day. The contribution that no one recognized. Here is where the historical narrative takes an interesting turn. In the months and years following the Battle of Britain, as the nation celebrated its survival and honored the pilots who had fought in the skies, a particular mythology began to develop. The mythology centered on the Spitfire. The Spitfire was celebrated in newspapers and magazines. Artists painted pictures of Spitfires. Pilots who had flown Spitfires became national heroes with their names known to the public. Children could buy model Spitfires. The Spitfire became the symbol of British air power, the symbol of British victory, the symbol of British technological achievement. The Hurricane, meanwhile, was relegated to the background. Yes, the Hurricane had been important. Yes, the Hurricane had contributed to the victory, but it was the Spitfire that captured the public imagination. It was the Spitfire that seemed to embody British excellence. It was the Spitfire that would be remembered. This historical injustice was not born of any malice or deliberate effort to obscure the truth. It was simply a natural consequence of the way popular history tends to develop. The more glamorous, more exciting, more visually striking aircraft, the Spitfire, dominated the narrative. The practical, reliable, less visually distinctive aircraft, the Hurricane, faded into the background. Even military historians, examining the records in the years after the war, sometimes failed to recognize the full extent of the Hurricane's contribution. They noted that the Hurricane had shot down many aircraft. They noted that the Hurricane had been important. But in the popular imagination, and even in many historical accounts, the Spitfire remained the primary focus. Production and planning, the invisible victory. Perhaps most significantly, the true source of British victory in the air war, production and logistics, remained largely invisible to the public, and even to many historians. The fact that the RAF could produce new aircraft faster than the Luftwaffe could build them was an unglamorous victory. It was not the kind of victory that newspapers celebrate. It was not the kind of victory that created heroes or inspired poets. But it was the victory that mattered. The fact that RAF pilots, when shot down over Britain, could bail out and return to flying status within days or weeks, while German pilots shot down over Britain were captured and lost to the war effort, this was an unrecognized strategic advantage
that had enormous consequences. The fact that the Hurricane could be repaired quickly, that damaged aircraft could be returned to service, that the manufacturing processes allowed for rapid replacement of destroyed aircraft, all of this was strategically important, but remained largely invisible. Sidney Cam, the designer of the Hurricane, had understood all of this. When Cam had chosen to design an aircraft for reliability and production rather than for cutting-edge performance, he had made a choice that seemed at the time to be somewhat conservative, somewhat unimaginative. But this choice proved to be profoundly strategic. The war continues. The Hurricane, beyond Britain. The Battle of Britain may have ended in November 1940, but the Hurricane's war was far from over. Throughout 1941 and 1942, Hurricanes continued to serve with the RAF and with Allied air forces around the world. When the German army invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, the Soviet Union desperately sought to acquire aircraft from its new British ally. The RAF agreed to send Hurricanes to the Soviet Union through the Lend-Lease program. Soviet pilots, initially skeptical of the Hurricane, which seemed slow and outdated compared to the modern fighters they had been expecting, discovered that the Hurricane possessed many of the same qualities that had made it so effective in the Battle of Britain. The aircraft was robust. It could absorb damage. It could be maintained by mechanics with minimal training. And it could turn tighter than the German Bf-109s that Soviet pilots were facing on the Eastern Front. Eventually, nearly 3,000 Hurricanes were delivered to the Soviet Union. Soviet pilots learned to respect the Hurricane. It became, for a time, one of the most numerous aircraft in the Soviet Air Force.
Hurricanes also served in North Africa, where they faced German and Italian aircraft. They served in the Far East against Japanese aircraft. They flew from aircraft carriers in the Mediterranean. They served in every major theater of World War II where the RAF operated. By the time production of the Hurricane ended in 1944, over 14,000 aircraft had been built. More Hurricanes were built than any other British fighter aircraft of the entire war. The Hurricane had become, in many ways, the backbone of British air power. Yet, despite these accomplishments, despite the extraordinary production numbers, despite the effectiveness of the aircraft in combat, the Hurricane remained in the shadow of the Spitfire.
The historical record. What really happened? In the years immediately after the Second World War, as historians began the process of compiling records and assessing what had happened, several facts emerged that contradicted the popular narrative. The most striking fact was this. In the Battle of Britain, the aircraft that had been primarily responsible for defeating the German Air Force was not the aircraft that everyone thought it was. The data was unambiguous. Of the German aircraft shot down by the RAF during the daylight air battles of 1940, approximately 60% had been destroyed by Hurricanes. The Spitfire, while certainly contributing significantly, had accounted for the remaining 40%. This meant that if one were to assign credit for the victory based on the actual outcome of air combat, the Hurricane deserved more credit than the Spitfire. But this data came out quietly in technical reports and military histories. It was not featured in popular histories. It was not celebrated in newspapers. It was not the narrative that the public wanted to hear. The public narrative was simpler. The Spitfire, the most advanced British fighter aircraft, had been matched against the German Bf-109, and the Spitfire had prevailed. This narrative was simple, elegant, and had the advantage of being partially true. Spitfires had indeed prevailed against Bf-109s in many engagements. But this narrative obscured a more important truth. that the victory had been won not by the aircraft that was individually most advanced, but by the aircraft that could be produced most efficiently. British aircraft factories working at full capacity produced approximately 100 fighter aircraft per week by late 1940. The vast majority of these were Hurricanes. German aircraft factories, despite the fact that Germany had conquered much of continental Europe and had access to vast resources, were producing aircraft at a much slower rate. German aircraft production in 1940 was approximately 30 fighter aircraft per week. This 3-to-1 production advantage was not an accident. It was the result of careful planning and industrial strategy. It was the result of aircraft design that optimized for production efficiency rather than for cutting-edge performance. Sidney Cam, the designer of the Hurricane, had understood this. When Cam had chosen manufacturing methods that were older and less advanced, but more easily produced, he had made a choice that was profoundly strategic. When Cam had designed the Hurricane to be maintainable and repairable rather than optimally efficient in all respects, he had made a choice that proved absolutely crucial. The Spitfire was in many ways a more beautiful aircraft. It represented the state of the art in 1940. It was faster, more agile in certain respects, and more glamorous. But the Spitfire could never be built in the numbers that the Hurricane could be built in. The Spitfire required more specialized manufacturing skills. The Spitfire required more complex machining. The Spitfire's design, while more advanced, was also more fragile in certain respects, more demanding to maintain, more prone to requiring specialized parts. In the context of total war, where production rates matter, where the ability to replace losses matters, where the ability to repair damaged aircraft matters, in this context, the Hurricane was the superior aircraft. Not because it was faster or more agile, but because it was more efficient in a systemic sense. It was more efficient in the context of an industrial war. The realization comes later.
It took decades for the full significance of the Hurricane's role in the Battle of Britain to be recognized by historians. In the 1950s, as books began to be published that tried to analyze the Battle of Britain in detail, some authors began to recognize the true role of the Hurricane. But these academic works had limited circulation. They were read by historians and military professionals, but they did not reach the general public. By this time, the mythology of the Spitfire had already been cemented in the public consciousness. The Spitfire was the symbol of British victory. The Spitfire was the aircraft that appeared in films and on stamps and in art. The Spitfire was the aircraft that people remembered. The Hurricane was forgotten. Even in the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s, as the Battle of Britain became more and more a subject of historical interest, as documentaries were made and books were written, the narrative remained largely the same. The Spitfire was celebrated. The Hurricane was mentioned as a supporting player in someone else's drama. This historical injustice was not corrected even as knowledge of the true facts became more widely available. The Spitfire's hold on the historical narrative, once established, proved to be extraordinarily difficult to dislodge. The broader lesson: what the Hurricane teaches us. But the story of the Hurricane is about more than just a footnote in aviation history. The Hurricane teaches a lesson that remains relevant to this day. A lesson about how wars are won, about how competitions are decided, about how systems interact. The common assumption is that the most technologically advanced solution to a problem is always the best solution.
This assumption is intuitive. It makes sense that the faster aircraft, the more advanced aircraft, the aircraft that pushes the boundaries of what is possible, should be superior to a more conventional aircraft. But the Hurricane demonstrated that this assumption is wrong. The Hurricane demonstrated that in a complex system, in a competition that extends over time, in a situation where production rates and sustainability matter, the most advanced solution is not necessarily the best solution. The Hurricane was not the most advanced fighter aircraft of its era. The Hurricane was the most effective fighter aircraft for the specific problem it had to solve. The Hurricane was designed to be built in large numbers. The Hurricane was designed to be maintained efficiently. The Hurricane was designed to accomplish the mission. And in the context of the Battle of Britain, it accomplished that mission better than any other aircraft available to the RAF. This is a lesson that applies beyond aviation. It applies to military strategy, to business competition, to economic rivalry, to any situation where production capacity, sustainability, and long-term competitive advantage matter.
As the decades have passed and the Battle of Britain has receded into history, the Hurricane has become increasingly forgotten. Aviation museums display Spitfires as the centerpiece of their collections, relegating Hurricanes to less prominent positions. Books about the Battle of Britain feature Spitfires on their covers. Documentary films focus on Spitfire pilots and Spitfire engagements. The Hurricane remains in the shadow. Yet the data is inescapable. The Hurricane shot down more German aircraft during the Battle of Britain than any other ARAF fighter aircraft. The Hurricane was more numerous than the Spitfire. The Hurricane had a greater impact on the battle's outcome than any other single aircraft. By every objective measure, the Hurricane was more important to British victory than the Spitfire. And yet, the Spitfire is remembered, celebrated, and honored, while the Hurricane is largely forgotten. This is not the fault of any individual or any conscious effort to distort history. It is simply the result of natural human psychology. The more glamorous, more visually striking, more advanced aircraft captures our imagination. The practical, reliable, less distinctive aircraft fades into the background. The pilots, unsung heroes. Yet there is another part of this story that deserves recognition. The pilots who flew the Hurricanes, many of them now deceased, their names known only to historians and aviation enthusiasts, these were the men who truly won the Battle of Britain. Pilot Officer George Unwin, who achieved over 20 victories in his Hurricane and survived the war only to die in a motorcycle accident in 1955, never lived to see the historical recognition that his aircraft finally achieved. Flying Officer Eric Locke, who accumulated over 20 victories in a Hurricane before being killed in combat, never knew that his aircraft would be largely forgotten while the Spitfire was celebrated in perpetuity. Squadron leader Robert Stanford Tuck, who survived the war and lived into the 1880s, spent his final years watching as the aircraft he flew, the Hurricane, was relegated to historical obscurity, overshadowed by the more famous Spitfire. These pilots flew the Hurricane not because they wanted to achieve historical glory, but because it was their duty. They flew it effectively, they defeated the German Air Force, they saved Britain. And they did it in an aircraft that most of their contemporaries considered secondary. The pilots of the Battle of Britain, flying Hurricanes or Spitfires, were the true heroes. But if we must assign credit for the victory based on the facts, then the credit belongs, in large measure, to the pilots of the Hurricane. A conclusion that is not really an ending. The story of the Hawker Hurricane is not a story that ends with the Battle of Britain. The Hurricane continued to serve in the RAF and in Allied air forces throughout the...
But the most important part of the Hurricane story is the part that history has largely forgotten, its role in the Battle of Britain. In the summer and autumn of 1940, when Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany, when the Nazi Air Force attempted to destroy the RAF and establish air superiority over Britain, it was the Hurricane that bore the primary burden of defense. It was the Hurricane that shot down the most German aircraft. It was the Hurricane that broke the back of the German bomber offensive. It was the Hurricane that, more than any other aircraft, ensured British survival. This fact is supported by the data. This fact is documented in military records. This fact is acknowledged by military historians. And yet, this fact remains largely unknown to the general public. The final reflection. Why does it matter that history has gotten this story partially wrong? Why does it matter that the Hurricane's contribution has been overshadowed by the Spitfires? It matters because understanding the true story teaches us something important about how the world actually works, as opposed to how we imagine it works. We imagine that wars are won by the most advanced technology. The reality is that wars are won by the combination of technology, production capacity, logistics, strategy, and human courage. We imagine that the most glamorous, most visually striking solution to a problem is always the best solution. The reality is that the solution that works most effectively within the actual constraints of the real world is often the best solution. We imagine that achievement and recognition go hand in hand. The reality is that many of the most important contributions to human achievement go largely unrecognized. The Hurricane teaches us all of these lessons, and that is why, even though the Hurricane has largely faded from public memory, its story remains worth telling.
Sidney Cam, the designer who chose practicality over perfection, reliability over cutting-edge performance, designed an aircraft that saved a nation. He did not set out to create the most advanced fighter aircraft. He set out to create an aircraft that could be built in large numbers, that could be maintained efficiently, that could accomplish the mission. And in choosing this path, Sidney Cam designed an aircraft that was, in the context of the Battle of Britain, more important than the more advanced aircraft with which it competed. The legacy. Today, more than 80 years after the Battle of Britain, the Hurricane has achieved a kind of quiet recognition among aviation historians and enthusiasts. There are hurricane restoration projects around the world. There are preserved hurricanes in museums. There are people who study the hurricane's history and appreciate its significance. But in the popular imagination, the Spitfire remains supreme. The Spitfire is the aircraft that people know. The Spitfire is the aircraft that appears in films and popular history. The Spitfire is the aircraft that symbolizes British achievement in the air. The Hurricane remains largely unknown outside of aviation enthusiast circles. This is a shame, not because the Spitfire does not deserve recognition. The Spitfire was indeed a remarkable aircraft and played an important role in the air war, but because the Hurricane's story, the story of how a practical, producible, maintainable aircraft proved more important to victory than a more advanced, more glamorous alternative, is a story that speaks to truths that remain relevant today. In any competition, in any conflict, in any situation where production rates matter, where sustainability matters, where systems matter more than individual performance, in all of these situations, the Hurricane's example is relevant. The Hurricane teaches us that glamour is not the same as effectiveness. The Hurricane teaches us that production is as important as design. The Hurricane teaches us that the aircraft that can be built in the greatest numbers and maintained most efficiently is more important than the aircraft with the best specifications. And perhaps most importantly, the Hurricane teaches us that history is written by those who remember it, and that the most important contributions often go largely unrecognized. The final verdict.
If we examine the historical record objectively, if we look at the actual data rather than the popular narrative, the conclusion is inescapable. The Hawker Hurricane was the most important fighter aircraft in the Battle of Britain. It shot down more enemy aircraft than any other RAF fighter. It bore the primary burden of defending British airspace.
It was more numerous and more productive than the Spitfire. And yet, for the past 80 years, the Spitfire has received the lion's share of recognition and celebration. This is not to denigrate the Spitfire. The Spitfire was an excellent aircraft and deserves recognition. But the recognition should be balanced with an acknowledgement of the Hurricane's equal or greater importance to the outcome of the Battle of Britain. If we had to choose one aircraft to represent the British victory in the Battle of Britain, that aircraft should be the Hurricane. Not because it was the most advanced aircraft, not because it was the most glamorous aircraft, but because it was the aircraft that accomplished the mission, that defeated the enemy, that saved the nation. The Hurricane is the aircraft that history forgot, and that is precisely why its story deserves to be told, remembered, and recognized.